Hello, welcome everybody this morning. We have a very interesting morning session, and at the end of the morning we'll have a lively panel. And we're starting today with Salil Vadhan, Professor of Computer Science here at the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. And Salil and I are collaborators in a project that he will be talking about on privacy tools. Welcome, Salil.
All right, thank you all for waking up this morning to come hear my talk, and to the organizers for inviting me to give this talk. So as Mircea mentioned, I'll be talking about a large collaborative multidisciplinary project we have here at Harvard on privacy tools for sharing research data, and fits very nicely, I think, at the intersection of privacy and security and big data. So hopefully will be of interest to many people in the room. So the starting point for our project, which launched a couple of years ago, was the revolution that was happening in the social sciences because of technology and all the new sources of data that technology enabled, and the ease of sharing such data. So social scientists now have access to data on unprecedented scales and providing more detail on human behavior and interactions than is possible by traditional means, such as surveys. So things like cell phone GPS readings, internet search logs, political blog posts, social network activity. They could really access to these data sets enable social scientists to see really how people are interacting in the wild and not just in a laboratory setting. However, it's widely understood that a major obstacle for realizing the full potential of this vision of computational, quantitative, and data-driven social science is privacy. So many of these data sets contain sensitive personal information, and researchers have an obligation to protect the privacy of their subjects. And unfortunately, traditional methods for protecting privacy, such as anonymization by removing identifiers, are now pretty well understood not to be effective. And what they present, and as I'll talk about in some more detail later, is a very stark trade-off between privacy and utility. So either you end up with very weak privacy protections, or you end up deteriorating the usefulness of the data for research purposes. And the result of this is that increasingly researchers are refusing to share their data with other researchers. So they collect one of these great data sets, they publish some papers on it, but then they don't make it available to the wider research community. And sometimes this is out of legitimate concern for the privacy of their subjects. Sometimes it's an excuse. But in either case, it's a significant problem because of the importance of other researchers being able to verify, replicate, extend the work that was done. If only one research group gets to use a data set, the process of science is really hindered. Okay, so sort of in cartoon form, the goal of our project is to bring us in a better place in this trade-off between privacy and the usefulness of data. And we're trying to do it through a collaboration between 4 disciplines. So computer science, that's where I come from. Social science, we're sitting here in the social science building, Institute for Quantitative Social Science, statistics, and law and policy. So trying to bring together sort of the increasing understanding about data privacy that's coming from computer science, computer scientists thinking about privacy over the past decade or two, which I'll talk about in some more detail, with the understanding of what social scientists and statisticians want to do with the data, the ways in which they want to analyze them, and from law and policy thinking about how we think about what our obligations are for protecting privacy. And we're doing this as a collaboration between 4 already interdisciplinary institutes here at Harvard, the Center for Research on Computation and Society, based in the School of Engineering, where I come from, the Institute for Quantitative Social Science, based right here, LaTanya Sweeney's Data Privacy Lab, which is housed here in IQSS, and the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, which is a university center that was founded at Harvard Law School. And our PIs and senior researchers on the project, myself, Steve Chong, and visiting Professor Kobe Nisim on the computer science side. Here from IQSS, our session chair, Merce Crosas, Gary King, founder and director of IQSS, James Honecker, LaTanya Sweeney, who I think will be on a panel later today, Edo Aroldi from Statistics, Micah Altman from MIT Libraries, and from the Berkman Center and Harvard Law School, Urs Gasser, who's the executive director of the Berkman Center, and David O'Brien, the senior researcher. And then we've also benefited from collaborations with a number of other wonderful visitors who have contributed and informed our efforts. Okay, so now let me try and delve into a little bit more detail. So the target of our effort is on data repositories and what we can do and build into data repositories to enable a greater sharing and privacy protective sharing of sensitive data sets. So in particular, we are working very closely with the Harvard Dataverse Network project. So that's the Dataverse Dataverse Network is an open source software infrastructure built here in IQSS, and that's used to host data repositories both at Harvard and many places around the world. In social science and many other fields. The instance here at Harvard is, according to some counts, the largest repository of social science data sets in the world. And so this is this software infrastructure is meant for enabling the sharing of data sets among researchers, citation, archiving, and analysis. So it provides tools for all of these purposes. But currently, generally speaking, Dataverse repositories and many other repositories don't want to have anything to do with privacy-sensitive data sets. They aren't equipped to take them on. And in the cases where a data set with privacy concerns is uploaded, generally it's not made available for others to download. So you see some examples here from the Murray Research Archive. Many of the data sets can be downloaded, but ones where there are privacy concerns are considered restricted. I guess it's a little bit hard to read, but you can't download those data sets. Just the citation information is available. And in some cases, there's a way in which you can apply for access, which is a very manual process, often involving the original researchers who collected the data sets, and that's a very kind of inefficient and not scalable approach to handling privacy-sensitive data. So our goal is to try to enable wider sharing while still protecting privacy. All right. So what are to try and bring out some of the main challenges that we're trying to cope with in this project? I would call out the following three. One is from the legal side, the complexity of privacy law is really astounding. There are thousands of different privacy laws that may or may not be applicable to a given data set. This is just in the US alone, and when you think about at different levels, federal law, state law, local law, it becomes a very complicated jungle for a researcher who just wants to do their work and share the results of their work and share their data with others, to think about how they might or might not be compliant with what the law requires in terms of protecting privacy of their subjects. And it's very domain specific. You have different laws and regulations that apply to health data like HIPAA, or education data like FERPA and PPRA, and it's very complicated. So how can we enable researchers to navigate this complexity without a privacy law expert working with them individually? Second, which I hinted at before, is that the traditional approach to protecting privacy, so this is de-identification by stripping identifiers from a data set, right? So then the data set looks anonymous and you think it's safe to share. We now understand quite well that this is not a generally speaking, effective approach to protecting privacy. So there are now many examples of this type, but one of the first and most dramatic examples was by LaTanya Sweeney in the late 90s, where she took supposedly anonymized medical insurance claims data that was released here in the state of Massachusetts, and you can see the diagram. Working. So the diagram over here, so these are the fields that remained in the released medical insurance claims data. The data set, they removed name, address, and some, they removed name and address, but there were still zip code, date of birth, and sex. And it turns out those three fields are enough to uniquely identify well over 50% of the US population. And she was able to figure out who the people in this medical insurance claims data set were by linking these three fields with publicly available voter registration lists. And in fact, identified the medical record of William Weld, who was governor of Massachusetts at the time, really causing a big splash and drawing a lot of attention to this issue. So this is just one example, and you might think, okay, well, how could we defeat this particular thing? And we won't put exact date of birth. Maybe we'll only put the year of birth and so on. But since then, there have been examples upon examples found by computer scientists and other privacy researchers showing that it is very difficult, if at all possible, to effectively anonymize data. With all the other sources of data that are available that someone can use, or information about a specific individual that someone can use to try to identify who they are in a data set, effective de-identification seems to require stripping all the usefulness out of your data set. And then the final challenge, which I mentioned on the previous slide, is another common process for dealing with privacy-sensitive data is that you don't make it publicly available, but you allow other researchers to apply for access. And currently, this is also a very inefficient and time-consuming process. We're told that in some cases, months of negotiations between different institutions and the lawyers on both sides negotiating over the terms may need to happen before the data is actually shared. And the original researchers often need to stay in the loop in this process, and if they stop doing research, move on to other things, the data may, again, end up being locked up and not available for others. Okay, so again, our goal, make sharing easier for non-expert researchers, ones without expertise in privacy law or the computer science and statistics literature that relates to privacy. So we're doing so by trying to think of the whole process from life cycle of data, from the time that a researcher first envisions a study they want to do and they apply to their IRB for institutional review board for review of their study, to when they get consent from their subjects and collect their data, to when they deposit it in a repository like the Dataverse Network, like a Dataverse Network repository, to when it's made available to researchers, other researchers for sharing. Most of our effort to date and where our interventions are really focused is on this stage where the researcher comes to deposit a data set that they've collected in a repository like the Dataverse Network. And I will tell you a little bit about two things we're thinking about there. First, a data tag generator, which is aimed largely at this question of how they navigate the law and the complex law and regulation associated with privacy. And then later I will talk about so we have in mind that after that process, they go through a survey here, which helps them figure out about the handling of their data set. We have in mind several different ways in which data may be shared, and for a given data set, one may use multiple of these, and I'll talk in some detail about the one we've been working on most, which is building tools for what's called differential privacy. All right, so data tags, the first part of this. This is a tool that helps a user, one who's depositing a data set, define and generate a policy for the handling of their data set. Okay, so how the data should be stored, whether it should be stored in encrypted form, whether it needs to be stored in encrypted form or not, transferred, and eventually accessed and used by others. Okay, and this, like our project as a whole, is again, collaboration across disciplines, computer law, data stewardship, and data science, like here in IQSS, as well as some input from computer science. So really, this part of the project, the biggest efforts are from our team at the Berkman Center, the legal team, and the data science team here in IQSS that's led by Mercedes. All right, so how does data tags work? There's three main steps. One is a dynamic questionnaire that guides the user depositing a data set through a series of questions, eliciting the necessary information to figure out what laws apply and how the data should be handled. Second is inference based on so that's dynamic. It's not that there's a fixed set of questions. Depending on their answers, they go through a different flow chart of questions. Step two is inference, figuring out based on these answers, what are the types of restrictions that are applicable or not applicable to the data set, and therefore how it should be handled. And the final step is an assignment of tags that are now associated with the data set and indicate the requirements on the handling of the data set. So the tags are quite sophisticated, as we'll see later, but there's also this sort of simple scale from blue to crimson, indicating at a high level sort of what level of sensitivity and care there needs to be in the handling of the data set. So, blue data sets are ones that are considered completely non-confidential and can store and share them freely. Crimson tends to be data sets where there's very high risk of serious harm if the data is compromised, and in order to have any sort of access to the data requires explicit permission. There should be strong verification and signed data use agreement, and then there's a whole range in between. So far, our legal team, in the scope of this project in just a few years, we don't expect that we'll build tools that handle the thousands of privacy laws in the US, much less international, but are kind of doing this as a proof of concept to show how such a tool might work and build it in a way that's extensible in the future by others to handle other domains. And to date, they focus mainly on three main domains: medical records, educational records, and government records. You can see some of the laws that are applicable in these cases here. Okay, and then here's what you can try it out at, I think it's datatags.org. If you like, there's a beta version of the tool there, and you can see what the survey looks like. So here's an example of a type of question related to education data. So this is asking whether the parents of the students were provided with certain notifications that are required. Okay, these PPRA notices, and you can see here it's keeping track of the set of answers that have been provided. There are ways to go back and revisit an answer that was previously provided. And as it's going, it's also keeping track of the sort of current tags, the constraints on the handling. Okay, so what kind of harm might there be if the data is accessed by someone who it shouldn't. So here's one where civil penalties may be at stake. The data is identifiable. It's not considered de-identified. Needs to be stored in encrypted form. Right? These are examples of some of the constraints that have come out through the survey. Here's another question that relates to medical data coming from HIPAA. So HIPAA has this notion of a covered entity to which the regulation applies, and so it's asking whether the data holder is a covered entity or an associate of a covered entity, or was the data collected by a covered entity. And then at the end, what's produced, unfortunately it's not projecting that clearly, but you get your tags here, which are, again, have all these fields for specifying how the data should be handled. So it's the data tags are quite high dimensional, but also a sort of a high level color. And this is an orange data set, may include sensitive, identifiable personal information, and can be shared with approved recipients under agreement. Okay, so there's a number of challenges here for data tags going forward that our team is grappling with. One is as I've hinted, the sort of vast array of considerations, and also going outside the domain of just what's in statutory law and regulation, but also the constraints that come from institutional policies, what in particular IRB has approved, what kind of consent researchers obtain from their subjects, what the best practices are in different research communities. Law is not mathematics. Also, there's many different interpretations of the law. Another is getting users to understand. So these are not lawyers going through this survey, but the natural tendency is to ask, if you ask the questions the way they're described in the law, you end up with a lot of legalese. Another important one is that many of the laws and regulations say that a de-identified data set can be handled differently than one that's not de-identified. But as we've discussed, the whole question of what should constitute de-identification is now understood to be quite problematic. And even though the law hasn't necessarily caught up to that, we'd like the tools that we're building to take our current understanding into account. So quite a few challenges, but we're optimistic about addressing many of these. All right, so in the time that's left, the next part of the talk, I'd like to tell you a little bit about something that's happening, a tool that operates more at the end of actually making information about the data available. It's work we're doing on differential privacy. And what is differential privacy? So differential privacy is a way of, right, instead of trying to anonymize a data set and release something that you hope is safe but still useful, instead differential privacy says what we're going to try to do is set up an interface for interacting with a data set. So rather than trying to release an anonymized version of the data set, well, there'll be an interface whereby people who want to analyze the data set can do so only through this interface. And what the interface is designed to do is to make sure that only aggregate statistical information can come out. All right, so researchers should be able to do statistical analysis of the data set, run eventually machine learning algorithms, statistical inference, and so on. But what they shouldn't be able to do is pull out information that's specific to individuals in the data set. Right? And this turns out to already be a very subtle problem, and very subtle to even define what it means to not pull out individual specific information. But a really promising framework started to be developed a little over about a decade ago in the theoretical computer science literature through a series of works leading to this concept of differential privacy. And what differential privacy requires is, in a precise mathematical sense, which I'll say a little bit more about, that the effect of each individual in the data set should be hidden from people interacting with the system. Okay, what does that mean? Let's be a little bit more detailed about it. All right, so we have this is just a toy medical data set here with sex, blood type, HIV status. You can imagine other fields in there as well. Right, and we say. Consider, differential privacy says, consider any potential adversary interacting with the system, right? That's trying to pull out information that's specific to a person, possibly someone they know well and are trying to target and learn more information about. And what differential privacy requires is that if we think of that person in the data set, right? So this is a male, blood type A, HIV negative. The adversary interacting with the system shouldn't be able to tell the difference if we take this person's data, erase it, and replace it with arbitrary other values. Okay, so here I replaced our male blood type A, HIV negative, with female blood type A, HIV positive. Right, so take any person's data, replace it with arbitrary other values, and adversary interacting with the system shouldn't be able to tell the difference. Okay, and this is regardless of what else they already know about that person, what other data sets they're trying to make use of. Okay. How could this be possible? Well, before telling you more about how it's defined, let's see an example. So your system here, I said, should be able to answer, give statistical information. So for example, an example of a statistical query is something like, what fraction of people in the data set are blood type B and HIV positive? Okay. And so now this interface isn't going to just give the exact answer to a question like that. But what it's going to do is going to take the actual answer and perturb it with a little bit of random noise. Okay, so it's going to introduce some random noise into the answer. And the claim is that to protect privacy in the strong way that I described a moment ago, it suffices to add quite a small amount of random noise to the answer when answering a question like this. Why is that? Well, how much can any one person change the answer to this question? Well, one person's data, since we're talking about a fraction of people in the data set, one person's data can change the answer by at most plus or minus 1 over n. Okay? So if we add random noise of a magnitude that's bigger than 1 over n, somewhat bigger than 1 over n, that should be enough intuitively to drown out the effect of any individual. Right? So, and the point is that 1 over n, as n, the size of your data set, goes to infinity. As the number of people in your data set gets large, the amount of noise that you're adding, the amount of error you're introducing, is going to 0 quite quickly. It's going to 0 linearly with n. Okay, so the point is very little noise is needed to hide each person's, the effect of each person's data as n goes to infinity. All right, well, this is just for answering one question of this type. Of course, in practice, one wants to not just ask one statistical question of a data set. You may want to ask many, and you may want to do more sophisticated statistics than just this one. One way of dealing with that is to increase the amount of noise that you're adding based on the number of questions that are being asked. Because otherwise, the amount of privacy protection will degrade. Eventually, an adversary could start canceling out the effect of the noise. So you can do this, and this works, and there are what are called composition theorems for differential privacy that quantify how your privacy degrades. But this simple approach of just treating each question on its own and possibly just increasing the amount of noise runs into a fundamental bottleneck that you can answer at most a quadratic number of queries, roughly n squared, where n is the number of people in your data set, if you take the simple approach of treating each query separately. But it turns out, I won't have time in today's presentation to talk about them, that there are much more sophisticated approaches that don't treat each question that comes in independently, but somehow take into account all the questions that have been asked before when answering a new one. And then you can do much more, much better than this. You can answer many more than a quadratic number of queries, even exponential in n, while still disguising the effect of each individual in the data set. Okay, so that's just to give you a taste. I mean, it's been a sort of decade of mathematical, theoretical work on this topic that's kind of led to these sorts of algorithms and results. So before moving on, I just will say a little bit more precisely what is the, how is this strong definition of privacy formalized. So as hinted, so this interface that we set up is going to be a randomized one. It's going to inject its own random noise into the way it computes the answers to queries so as to protect privacy. And the formal requirement is that we say, consider any two data sets, D and D prime, that differ on one individual's data, and any sequence of queries that a potential adversary might ask. So any sequence of queries that they feed into the system, the distribution of results that are produced, that are seen by a potential adversary, is roughly the same under database D as it is under database D prime. Okay, and so in that sense, the effect of each individual, since D and D prime are any two data sets that differ in one row, the effect of each individual is hidden. There is some, how close are these distributions, and these probability distributions are taken over the randomness injected by the curator, the random noise. There's some parameter, epsilon, that measures the level of privacy protection, how much privacy you're providing to each individual. The smaller epsilon is, the closer the distributions, the higher the level of privacy protection. All right, so I just gave one very simple example, again, counting the fraction of people in the data set with some property, which you can answer with random noise. I hinted that there are much more sophisticated approaches possible. And indeed, there's now a literature showing how a very wide array of the kind of data analysis tasks that people like to do with data are compatible with differential privacy. Compatible in the sense, similar sense to what I said before, that as the size of the data set grows, as n goes to infinity, the quality of results produced by the differentially private versions of these algorithms is approaches the same quality that you would have even if you didn't have privacy constraints. Right? And so if you're interested in seeing more, there was a nice, a great workshop a year ago on big data and differential privacy where there were talks on many of these different kinds of data analysis tasks, and both the theory and the practice implementations and experimentation. All right, so I don't have much time, so I'm not going to talk more about the definition of differential privacy, but just mention that this, there are, just like with data tags, there are a number of challenges. For most of the work on differential privacy has been theoretical work, people proving theorems about what's possible or impossible in principle. There's a lot of challenges in now translating that theory to practice. So one, for example, is that most of these results are asymptotic results. As n, the size of your data set, grows, the differentially private algorithms are doing very well. Getting these things to perform well at modest-sized data sets is a challenge that requires a lot of additional work and optimization. Some of the methods that I talked about, the ones that can answer even an exponential number of statistical queries with high accuracy and privacy, have computational complexity challenges associated with them. The computing power time required grows very quickly with the dimensionality of the data. There are lots of interesting challenges here. But fortunately, there are lots of efforts happening around the country and around the world to try and bring differential privacy to practice. I think there's a lot of reason for optimism. What we are doing along those lines is perhaps different than many of the other efforts in the following respects. So one, We are focused on trying to build very general purpose tools for differential privacy because we're thinking of this use case of a data repository, which has to handle a very heterogeneous collection of data sets that anyone who has collected a data set and wants to make available to others might be coming to upload. Second, we're trying to build tools that are really automated in the sense that there's not a differential privacy expert working with a particular researcher who's collected a data set to figure out how can we optimize differential privacy and get the most mileage out of it for your data set that's of a particular type. Finally, we are thinking of a tiered access model, in part because of the challenges raised by trying to do something that's automated and general purpose. We are thinking of the differentially private interface that we're designing as being one to provide wide access to rough statistical information. All right, and the point of this is to help users decide whether it's worth applying for access to the raw data. Okay, whether it's worth jumping through the sort of additional hoops, which will hopefully also make more efficient as well. But this is not a new model. Census does this also, that they have their public use microdata samples that are publicly available, but people can apply to go to one of their research data centers to get access to raw data. All right, so I will just finish with a quick sort of just demonstration, like it's 1 minute, I think, or 2 minutes, maybe if I remember the timing right, of the tools that have been, have been built so far. So this is right now a tool for a researcher to be able to, let me just pause it while we're here, to decide on a set of statistics. These are not queries coming in. That's something that's down the road, next thing for us to build. Decide on a set of statistics to release and make publicly available about their data set. So here they're selecting what variable those statistics are on, and then various information that's needed about those variables to apply differentially private algorithms. So you need to know what the type of it, whether it's a numerical variable or a categorical or a Boolean variable. Type of statistic, do you want to release an approximation of the histogram, of the means and the variances, or the quantiles, cumulative distribution function, and various other information you might need to know, range information on the variable, a number of bins for a categorical variable. And what this tool is doing is partitioning that epsilon, what's called the privacy budget, among the variables, and showing how it trades off the accuracy. So some statistics can be provided with differing levels of accuracy. The more statistics you want to produce, the less accurate they're going to be, and a researcher may want to tune to have certain statistics be more accurate than others. Okay, so then you submit, and now when the data set, this is really hard to see, is available in Dataverse, and you click the Explore button to explore the statistical information about the data set, all the variables are, this is the Two Ravens tool, which is a project building tools for statistical analysis of data sets into Dataverse. As you scroll through the variables, you see all of this differentially private statistical information about the variable being made available. You see approximations of the CDF of the age variable, approximations of the histogram of the, say, education variable here. Eventually, these will also show the errors introduced for privacy. And eventually, this Two Ravens tool, what it does is also provides a very easy interface for doing statistical analysis. So like doing a regression, you want to see how is income predicted by the other variables, sex, marriage, education, and age. And you would click on one of the common, like say, least squares regression, and it will perform the regression for you. And eventually, this will be done also in a way that preserves this strong notion of privacy, of differential privacy. So this is something that we're building. Hopefully, it won't be long before something that you can play with as a prototype will be available. So conclusions. Hopefully, you've taken away from this that there are many challenges in the sharing of privacy-sensitive data, but we believe that there is hope for it being made easier, and tools are starting to come out. We're working on some. There are others around the country working on them. If you're interested, you can join our news feed for our project. There's also many opportunities if you have students who want to come do a summer internship with us, an RU program, or at the law school level or graduate student level. We really welcome that. And I'll just end here with the team of many great people who are involved in the work I described.
Any questions for Salil?
Wondering what the input to the interfaces is. Epsilon the input, or is it the error? So the researcher kind of figures out what is an appropriate epsilon because of the privacy trade-offs. I'm just wondering.
Right, so epsilon will be the starting point for that. And that is in part going to be informed eventually by the data tags process that I talked about earlier in the talk. So thinking about what is the level of sensitivity of the data, the amount of harm, and what obligations the researcher has to protect privacy, and that will guide the choice of epsilon. We'll make some recommendation, they'll be able to adjust it.
And a follow-up question I had is that after the researcher decides the privacy-related trade-off, they then export these statistics, right, the ones that you were showing us. And that's presumably for another party to look at, right?
Yes.
So does that party have an idea of what the accuracies are, how off it is? Are they giving
Yes, they will. So it's not yet in the graphics that I showed, but eventually all these histograms will have error bars on them. Even the CDF plot will have a kind of an error bar. Everything will have errors introduced for privacy reasons shown. That's right.
Just to note that data tags, you can go to datatags.org and already try it. It's in beta, but you can give us feedback. It's fully functional, but not yet integrated with this privacy tools, well, with Dataverse and the privacy tools. But we will, when we integrate it, we'll also get it opening to the users to give us feedback.
So your data tags get at the notion of utility, and do you have an explicit probability of identification so you can have a decision theoretic threshold on when you release data or not? It looked to me like many approaches actually come out with a specific probability of being able to identify.
All right, so it's a great question. So there are ways to interpret the privacy parameter of differential privacy and try to connect it to probability of identification. I think one thing that's important to keep in mind about the existing tools is that they really, about probability of identification, re-identification for de-identified data sets, is those are really only providing a lower bound on the probability of re-identification. So those tools will generally tell you people in this data set, you can expect to have at least this probability of being re-identified, because what they're doing is saying if someone tries to link on this set of fields, what's the chance that someone's going to be unique? But it doesn't apply to other strategies that haven't been, that you aren't thinking about, using other variables, using auxiliary information that you haven't conceived of. So differential privacy sort of takes an opposite approach and says, we're going to try to handle all possible adversarial strategies, regardless of what auxiliary information they have available. And it does more than trying to protect being able to sort of identify someone. They prevent, even if you know someone quite well and know lots of information about them, pulling out additional information about them, like their HIV status or some other sensitive information, will still be hard to do. Impossible to do in a statistical sense.
It's a very fascinating research, and I was wondering, you mentioned that there is an inverse relationship between the number of records and the amount of noise to be introduced to achieve differential privacy. Is there any constraint in terms of the number of dimensions in the data on that particular?
Yeah, so I hinted at that high dimensional data does present additional challenges. And actually, it's a recent result that the algorithms always had this dependency on the dimension, but we didn't actually have a proof until within the last year. There's a paper with a graduate student and postdoc of mine where we show that actually there is necessarily a deterioration with the number of dimensions of the data. So even for Boolean data, and you want to release the marginals of the attributes, the error needs to grow like square root of the dimensions, and that's a tight result. So it's like square root of the dimension over n is the dependence for high dimensional data.
I think we'll wrap up the questions here. And thanks, Salil, again. We have something for you.
On the behalf of Academy of Science and Engineering, we want to acknowledge and appreciate today's keynote speaker, Dr. Salil Vadhan, Computer Science, Harvard School Engineering and Applied Science. I request Dr. Justin Jhan, Conference Steering Chair, to give this appreciation certificate to Dr. Salil Vadhan.